The night smelled of bread. Warm, crusted loaves lined the shelves of a small bakery on Pudding Lane, the humblest corner of a city swollen with life. In the dim light of the hearth, a child sat cross-legged, lulled by the crackle of the oven fire. He could not know, none of them could, that this ember, flickering so innocently in his father's oven, would soon awaken as a beast of flame, a monster that would devour London whole. The city itself was tinder, waiting for a spark. Its streets were narrow veins clogged with refuse, timber houses pressed together so tightly that one man could shake hands with his neighbor from opposite windows. Above, the roofs leaned toward each other like conspirators, as though they whispered of coming doom. It had been a long, hot summer, the air dry as parchment, the wood thirsty for fire. London was a powder keg, dressed in oak and pitch, and that night the fuse was struck. At first it was only a whisper, smoke rising where it should not, a maid's cry in the street, a faint glow behind shuttered windows. The child's eyes widened as sparks leapt higher than the rafters. Then came the roar, sudden, unearthly as the bakery erupted. Flames clawed through beams, licking greedily at the air, spilling from one rooftop to the next with a hunger that could not be sated. By dawn, the fire had become a living thing, a dragon of orange and gold, unfurling its wings across the heart of the city. Londoners awoke to chaos. Bells rang from church towers, not for worship but for warning. Men staggered barefoot into alleys, clutching buckets of water too small, too late. Mothers dragged their children through the smoke. Merchants heaved chests of silver onto carts, while thieves cut purses in the confusion. Horses shrieked, hooves striking sparks on the cobblestones as they bolted in terror. The streets became rivers of fire and panic, and above it all the dragon roared. Rumors spread as fast as the blaze, that it was no accident, that foreigners had plotted to burn the city, that Catholics or Dutchmen or even the king himself had kindled the Inferno. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor. In the glow of the flames, suspicion gleamed sharper than any sword. Yet no finger of blame could stop the fire. It leapt the Thames itself, driven by winds that howled like demons, reducing houses, shops, even the mighty Guildhall to heaps of cinders. By the third day, the fire had reached its zenith. St. Paul's Cathedral, sanctuary of the faithful, pride of London, stood silhouetted against the infernal sky. Its stones cracked from the heat, its timbers blazed like torches, until the great dome groaned and collapsed in a storm of sparks. To those who watched, it seemed as though God had abandoned the city. And yet, even as the flames consumed all that was built, something else was being forged, a vision of rebirth. When at last the dragon was slain, when the smoke thinned and the embers cooled, London lay in ruins, but not in silence. Out of the ash rose voices, plans, the stubborn heartbeat of a people who refused to be extinguished. The child from Pudding Lane, now orphaned and soot-stained, would live to see a city reborn from the very fire that had nearly ended it. This was not merely a disaster, it was a crucible. For in the Great Fire of 1666, London lost everything. Yet, from destruction, it would rise anew, greater, grander, eternal. Before the Inferno, there was a city already trembling under the weight of its own contradictions. London in the mid-17th century was both a jewel of trade and a festering labyrinth of danger, the pride of a kingdom and the shame of its people. To understand the fire, one must first understand the city it consumed, a place built not only of wood and stone, but of fear, faith, and folly. The London of 1666 had grown restless, its population swollen to nearly 500,000 souls, packed into a space never meant to contain them. Streets were little more than crooked alleys, twisted veins through which humanity pulsed in endless congestion. Timber houses leaned inward, their upper stories jutting out so far that daylight itself was strangled in narrow corridors. Windows were filled with grease-stained paper, walls plastered with pitch, beams so dry they cracked at the whisper of heat. Rats scurried underfoot, fattened by refuse that no authority bothered to collect. The city stank of waste and smoke, the perfume of survival in a place where order was fragile, and chaos lurked in every shadow. This was a city haunted by memories of death. Barely a year had passed since the last great visitation of plague. 1665. The Black Death had scythed through London, leaving tens of thousands of corpses piled in plague pits. Whole parishes had been silenced, doors marked with red crosses as warnings of contagion. Priests muttered prayers over carts of the dead, while the living fled in terror, or sealed themselves indoors, waiting for the angel of death to pass them by. By the time the plague had ebbed, London was wounded, hollow-eyed, staggering under grief, but still it endured, as if clinging to the hope that suffering must surely be at an end. Yet fate had other plans. In truth, the city was a tinderbox, and all who walked its streets sensed it, though they dared not say so aloud. Small fires were common, flaring in kitchens or workshops, quickly smothered with pails of water, or beaten back with blankets. Londoners treated them as nuisances, not omens, blind to how thin the line had grown between survival and annihilation. Bucket brigades were few, water pipes unreliable, fire hooks scattered. The wealthier merchants built tall warehouses of tarred wood, their storerooms stuffed with oil, brandy, coal, tallow, and gunpowder, every commodity a silent accomplice to the fire yet to come. And still, the city thrived. On the River Thames, ships from every corner of the world docked daily, their holds heavy with spices from the Indies, silks from China, tobacco from the New World. London had become the beating heart of commerce, where fortunes could be won or lost overnight. Taverns overflowed with sailors boasting of exotic ports, while goldsmiths and bankers in Lombard Street counted coins that glittered brighter than the sun. The city hummed with ambition, with the fever of trade, even as its foundations rotted beneath the weight of greed. Religion, too, was a fire smoldering beneath the surface. The civil wars were still within living memory, and the kingdom remained divided in spirit. Anglicans, Catholics, Puritans, all distrusted one another, each ready to blame the other for every calamity. Whispers of plots, treason, and divine punishment filled the air as thickly as smoke. For many, the plague of 1665 had already seemed like the wrath of God. What then would they think of the Inferno of 1666? That it was not mere accident, but prophecy fulfilled, the end of days foretold in Revelation. And what of the people themselves, the lifeblood of the city? They were bakers and brewers, seamstresses and cobblers, beggars and thieves. Children ran barefoot in the alleys, their laughter mingling with the curses of drunkards. Apprentices hauled barrels through the markets, while hawkers shouted the price of fish gone rancid in the sun. It was a world both teeming with vitality and suffocating in squalor, a place where life was cheap and survival was a daily triumph. Among these countless souls was a baker on Pudding Lane, whose oven glowed through the long nights, feeding the city's hunger for bread. He was an ordinary man, no different from hundreds of others who labored in their trades, yet it was in his humble shop, in the careless ember that escaped his hearth, that the destiny of London was sealed. History is often cruel in this way. The fate of empires balanced on the smallest of accidents, the mightiest of cities undone by a spark too small to notice until it was too late. London, in truth, had built the stage for its own destruction. Every timber house, every crooked alley, every storehouse packed with combustibles was a line of dry grass waiting for a flame. The plague had not been enough to cleanse the city, nor the endless warnings of smaller blazes. Pride had made Londoners deaf to the ticking clock of catastrophe. They lived as though tomorrow were guaranteed, as though the world they had cobbled together from wood and sweat and ambition could endure forever. But beneath that illusion lay fragility. The city's grandeur was a mask stretched thin over decay, and when the fire came, it tore the mask away, revealing not strength, but vulnerability. This was London's childhood, if one can call it that. A reckless youth, sprawling and defiant, blind to its own mortality. The people built upward and outward, crowded closer together, daring fate with every timber they raised. They believed themselves untouchable, certain that London would stand eternal. Yet the truth was already written in its bones. It was a city designed to burn. It began as a whisper, a glow behind shuttered windows, a trickle of smoke curling upward into the night. At first, there was no cause for alarm. Fires were part of London's rhythm, as familiar as the tolling of bells. A spark in a kitchen, a chimney gone too dry, a torch dropped carelessly. Such things happened often enough. Men fetched water, women shouted warnings, neighbors beat at flames with blankets. By morning, the ashes cooled, and life went on. Why should this night be any different? But this fire did not cool. It spread with unnatural hunger, leaping from beam to beam, roof to roof, as if the city itself had been waiting to burn. Pudding Lane was narrow, lined with wooden houses that leaned upon each other like conspirators, and when one was consumed, the next caught swiftly, as though eager to share the fate. By dawn, the blaze had devoured 300 yards of street. By mid-morning, it had become an inferno. The wind turned traitor. Gusts from the east fanned the flames, driving them deeper into the city. Sparks flew like arrows, carried across lanes and alleys, landing on thatched roofs and haylofts, igniting fresh blazes faster than any bucket brigade could quench them. Londoners ran in panic, some clutching bundles of clothes, others dragging carts piled with goods. Horses screamed and reared as carriages toppled, blocking the streets, trapping families between walls of fire. Those who tarried lost everything: belongings, homes, lives. The city's leaders hesitated, and hesitation was fatal. The Lord Mayor, awoken by frantic messengers, dismissed the danger with weary contempt. A woman could piss it out, he said to have muttered. He refused to authorize the tearing down of houses to create firebreaks, fearing the wrath of property owners more than the wrath of flame. And so, precious hours slipped away, while the dragon of fire gathered strength. By Sunday afternoon, London was a cauldron. Entire parishes vanished in a storm of embers. The fire advanced like an army, driving thousands before it. Bells clanged frantically, not in harmony, but in chaos, each parish warning its people that death was at their door. Churches filled with refugees, only to become pyres when the flames reached them. The smell of smoke choked the air. The glow turned night into a false dawn, painting the sky blood red. Panic bred violence. Rumors spread, that foreign agents had set the fire. Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Catholics, anyone who could be named an enemy. Mobs roamed the streets, seizing strangers, beating them bloody in the glow of the Inferno. Some were dragged to the river and drowned. Others slashed with knives, their cries lost beneath the roar of collapsing timbers. Fear made executioners of ordinary men, and the fire's cruelty was matched by human hands. By the second night, the fire had swollen into something beyond comprehension. Flames climbed 100 feet high, roaring like the voice of God himself. The heat melted lead from rooftops, sending rivers of molten metal down gutters. Stone cracked and split apart. Glass windows exploded outward with a sound like musket. Fire. The fire leapt the Thames, igniting warehouses filled with pitch, hemp, and oil, and the river boiled with burning debris. Barges loaded with goods burst into flame midstream, drifting torches that carried destruction to the far banks. Amidst this apocalypse, stories of heroism flickered like candles. Men and women carried the sick upon their backs, ferried the aged across burning bridges, risked their lives to rescue strangers from collapsing houses. Families clung together, fleeing through streets littered with smoldering rubble. Some loaded what they could onto boats, pushing off from the burning quays, praying the river would shield them. Others sought refuge in the open fields beyond the city walls, watching as their world burned behind them. Still the fire grew. By the third day, it reached Cheapside, the great artery of London's commerce. Shops that once dazzled with silks, jewels, and fine glass were reduced to blackened ruins in hours. The Royal Exchange, heart of England's trade, collapsed in a shower of sparks, its merchants scattering like ants before a torch. Even the mighty Guildhall succumbed, its stone walls scorched, its timbers consumed, its proud chambers reduced to rubble. But the most terrible blow came when the fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral. For centuries it had stood as the soul of the city, its massive walls of stone believed impregnable. Refugees had piled their treasures inside, convinced that here, at least, they would be safe. Printers stacked their books, merchants stored their wares, priests prayed within the vaulted nave. But the cathedral was ringed with wooden scaffolding for repair, and when the flames touched it, the ancient church became a torch. The heat was monstrous. Stones buckled, iron glass melted, timbers flared like kindling. Witnesses spoke of a great roar, as though the cathedral itself screamed, before the roof caved in and the great dome collapsed. A storm of sparks rose into the heavens, visible for miles, as if the city's soul had been torn from its body. To many, it was proof of divine judgment. If even God's house could burn, what hope had man? By then, the fire was no longer an accident. It was a force of nature, an elemental wrath. Londoners spoke of it as though it lived, a beast with breath and hunger, with claws of flame and eyes of smoke. It was the dragon that devoured the city, and nothing could halt its march. For 4 days, it raged, unchecked, reducing 2/3 of London to ash. 87 churches fell, along with thousands of homes, countless shops, warehouses, and taverns. The wealth of generations was consumed in hours. Families who had known riches found themselves paupers, huddled in fields beneath makeshift tents. And still the dragon roared, until at last, when the wind shifted, and desperate men pulled down houses in its path, the beast began to weaken. But the rise of the fire had already changed London forever. The city that had prided itself on commerce and power now knelt in ruin. From the whisper of smoke on Pudding Lane, the flames had risen to claim the very heart of an empire. What began as a spark had become an apocalypse, a reminder that all human ambition, all pride and labor, could be reduced to cinders in a single night. When the flames had reached their zenith, when the dragon of fire towered above the city and its roar drowned out all other sound, London was not merely consumed by flame, but by madness. It was no longer only the houses, churches, and markets that crumbled. It was the fragile bonds of society itself, the threads of trust and order that held the city together, which snapped under the unbearable heat. By the 4th day, the fire had spread terror, faster than it spread destruction. Rumors became as lethal as sparks. Foreigners were accused of conspiracy. Dutchmen and Frenchmen were seized in the streets, their accents treated as proof of guilt. Strangers were beaten to death while the city burned around them, their blood mingling with the ashes. Others whispered of Catholic plots, of papist agents sent by Rome to destroy Protestant London in vengeance. Some claimed the French king had ordered it. Others pointed to merchants, to beggars, to anyone whose face did not look familiar. Suspicion became a second fire, an invisible blaze that set neighbor against neighbor, and the mob's fury burned, as brightly as the city itself. In the chaos, law collapsed. Constables abandoned their posts, overwhelmed by the tide of fleeing humanity. Soldiers sent to maintain order were powerless, their commands lost in the roar of flames. Men armed themselves with clubs and knives, not to fight the fire but to protect their goods, or to seize the goods of others. The River Thames became choked with barges, many overloaded to the point of sinking, as families tried to ferry their possessions to safety. Some were robbed midstream, their cargoes stolen by desperate men, who cared not for ownership in a world that seemed to be ending. The king himself, Charles II, rode through the burning streets with his brother, the Duke of York, urging men to tear down houses and form firebreaks. For a moment, the sight of the monarch laboring with his people inspired awe, but it was too little, too late. His voice, though royal, could not carry above the roar of the Inferno, and his orders drowned in the sea of confusion. Where the crown faltered, despair filled the void. The suffering of the poor was the most harrowing. While the wealthy had carriages to flee, and lands beyond the city where they might seek refuge, the poor had nothing but the clothes upon their backs. They stumbled through smoke-choked alleys, clutching their children, driven from one burning quarter to another. When at last they reached the fields outside the walls, they collapsed in exhaustion, forming seas of refugees. Some huddled in St. George's Fields, others on Moorfields, where makeshift tents of cloth and timber sprang up like a second city, this one built of misery and ash. There, under the open sky, men and women wept for all they had lost. Homes, livelihoods, memories of generations. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, the air was thick with smoke, and the nights echoed with cries of despair. But the downfall was not merely physical, it was spiritual. For many, the fire seemed not an accident of chance, but the judgment of God. Preachers cried aloud that London was a new Babylon punished for its sins, its taverns, its brothels, its greed, its pride. In the flames, they saw revelation made manifest, the end of days written in sparks and smoke. Some fell to their knees in the fields, begging forgiveness, believing that the Inferno heralded the second coming of Christ. Others, driven mad with grief, cursed God's name and declared him absent, a tyrant who had turned his face away. The faith that had bound the city, now cracked and splintered beneath the weight of loss. And yet, even as people searched for divine answers, they sought earthly scapegoats. Foreigners bore the brunt, but not only they. Some blamed the king's Catholic brother, the Duke of York, whispering that he had set the fire to clear the way for papist rule. Others muttered of the city's own officials, of corrupt aldermen who had failed to act swiftly, who had cared more for property than for human life. The Lord Mayor, who had scoffed that a woman could piss out the fire, became a figure of ridicule and rage. London's political heart, already weakened by decades of civil war and suspicion, now throbbed with recrimination. The fire was no longer a disaster alone, it was a weapon of accusation, sharpened by fear. Nor did the flames consume only buildings. They devoured memory. Records, libraries, archives, all gone. Entire histories of families, guilds, and parishes vanished overnight, burned to cinders. Generations of books, sermons, and chronicles were lost, as though the city's very soul had been erased. What remained was a terrible emptiness, a silence more devastating than the roar of fire. A city without memory is a city without anchor, and London found itself adrift, stripped of its past even as it trembled for its future. When at last the wind shifted and the fire began to die, the devastation was almost beyond comprehension. 4 days of destruction had reduced 87 churches, 13,000 houses, and nearly the entire medieval heart of London to rubble. Where once had stood bustling markets, lively parishes, and noble halls, there was now only a smoking desert. The air was thick with the stench of charred wood, scorched stone, and the faint sickening odor of burned flesh. Survivors wandered the ruins in silence, stunned, as though their voices had been stolen. The downfall was total. London was no longer a city of commerce and ambition, of wealth and power. It was a wasteland. Its people, once so proud, now shuffled, like beggars among the ashes, their eyes hollow, their futures uncertain. Merchants who had dealt in silk and spice bartered now for bread. Nobles who had lived in splendor sat weeping beside the poor. Fire is the great equalizer. In its blaze, all men are stripped bare, and all pride is reduced to ash. But perhaps the cruelest truth was this: the fire had not destroyed London by chance. It had revealed London to itself. The city was a giant, built of wood and greed, of arrogance and neglect. And when the flames came, they merely finished what London had already begun. The downfall was not the work of a single night. It was the inevitable consequence of years of carelessness, of pride that believed the city eternal. The fire did not only burn London, it judged it. The climax of the Great Fire was not a single moment, but a series of crescendos, each more terrible than the last, until the city itself seemed to break beneath the weight of tragedy. By the 5th day, London was a vision of hell on earth, a landscape where fire and smoke and human despair had fused into one terrible reality. The flames that had risen like a dragon now writhed in its death throes, yet even in dying, it struck with fury, consuming everything within reach. The fields outside the city walls were black seas of refugees. Families crouched beneath makeshift tents of blankets stretched over sticks, their possessions, what little they had saved, piled beside them. The night was pierced by cries, children calling for mothers lost in the chaos, mothers searching for sons who had vanished in the smoke, fathers cursing their helplessness. The air reeked of ash and sweat and grief, a smell that clung to the skin and would not wash away. From the hilltops, They could see the city burning, an ocean of flame rolling through streets they once called home. Many fell silent before that sight, as though they gazed upon Judgment Day itself. And then came the collapse of St. Paul's. Though the cathedral had already been wounded by fire, it stood defiantly for hours, a silhouette against the infernal sky. Within, hundreds of refugees had placed their faith in its walls, believing stone could withstand what timber could not. Booksellers had stacked volumes inside, certain the treasures of English print would be safe under God's roof. Priests prayed with raised arms, invoking the Almighty to preserve his house, but the Almighty was silent. The scaffolding that embraced the cathedral flared like a torch. Flames climbed the great tower. Smoke poured from its windows like the breath of a dying titan. Witnesses swore they heard a groan, as though the stones themselves lamented. Then, with a deafening roar, the dome collapsed inward, sending a geyser of sparks into the heavens. The ground shook, the air thundered, and the refugees within were buried beneath an avalanche of fire and rubble. For miles around, people cried out, as though struck by the same blow. The heart of London had fallen. In that moment, something broke in the people's spirit. If even St. Paul's could burn, what hope remained for mortal men? Tears streaked faces blackened by soot. Some tore their clothes and beat their breasts, declaring London accursed. Others sank to their knees, whispering prayers through trembling lips. Convinced the world was ending, faith and despair walked hand in hand, and the fire mocked both. In the city itself, the tragedy took on new forms. Looters prowled the edges of the Inferno, seizing goods from abandoned houses, carrying silver and linens through the smoke. Some were caught and beaten. Others melted into the chaos like phantoms. Law had no meaning. Men fought with one another, for scraps of food, for space on a barge, for the chance to save their families. The line between survival and savagery vanished, as thin as the line between flame and smoke. On the river, the scene was no less desperate. The Thames glowed red with reflection, its waters crowded with barges and skiffs overloaded with people and goods. Some sank beneath their burdens, spilling men, women, and children into the dark water. Flames licked the quays, setting boats ablaze where they floated. Sailors rowed furiously, trying to escape, while the fire rained sparks upon their decks. For those who survived the crossing, the sight of London burning behind them seared itself into memory. A vision of apocalypse carried forever in their eyes, and still, amidst despair, there were acts of impossible courage. A mother threw herself into the flames to drag her son from a collapsing house. A priest carried the communion chalice through streets of fire, determined the sacrament should not be lost. Sailors risked their lives to ferry strangers to safety, rowing back again and again into the smoke. Such acts were small against the vastness of the Inferno, yet they glowed like embers of humanity in a world turned monstrous. By the sixth day, the fire had spent its rage. Firebreaks carved by desperate hands had finally bitten into its path. The wind, at last, relented. The dragon gasped its final breath, and the roar dwindled to crackles, the glow to smolder. But what remained was a graveyard. 87 churches, 400 streets, 13,000 homes, gone. 2/3 of the city had vanished. From Aldgate to Ludgate, from the Tower to the Fleet, there stretched nothing but ash and ruin. The tragedy was not only in what was lost, but in what was left behind. Tens of thousands were homeless, their lives reduced to soot. Merchants who once counted riches in gold now counted their families in hunger. Children wandered alone, orphans in a city that could no longer shelter them. The poor, already broken by plague, now faced starvation, and through it all loomed the silence of the dead, the uncounted who had perished in flames, their bodies consumed so utterly that not even bones remained. In the end, the fire revealed truths too terrible to ignore. It showed the vanity of man's pride, the fragility of his labors, the cruelty of fate. It showed how swiftly life could unravel, how a single spark could undo centuries of toil. But most of all, it showed that tragedy is not merely destruction. Tragedy is the echo that follows, the silence where once there was life, the emptiness that stares back long after the flames are gone. For those who lived through it, the Great Fire was not just an event, it was a scar carved into the soul. For the child of Pudding Lane, who had watched the spark in his father's oven become a dragon, it was the loss of innocence. For the merchant who saw his wares vanish in smoke, it was the loss of fortune. For the priest who wept before the ruins of St. Paul's, it was the loss of faith. Each Londoner carried their own tragedy, woven into the greater tragedy of the city itself, and when the smoke cleared, when the last ember faded and only ash remained, London stood at the edge of despair. The fire had not only destroyed the city, it had broken it. And in that brokenness lay the final bitter truth that nothing, not stone, nor wealth nor faith itself, is immune to flame. When the last embers cooled and the choking veil of smoke finally lifted, London awoke to silence. Not the silence of peace, but of absence, the absence of walls, of roofs, of hearths, of voices. A city once deafening with trade, gossip, and The clang of church bells now whispered only with the faint hiss of dying coals. The dragon was dead, but its shadow lingered, and yet, from the ashes rose something that flame could not consume. In the fields beyond the walls, where the displaced huddled beneath tents and makeshift shacks, the murmur of despair began to mingle with a murmur of resolve. Out of ruin, the idea of London survived, scarred, but unyielding. For the city was not merely timber and stone, it was the sum of its people, their stubborn will to endure. Rebuilding began almost before the ashes cooled. Charles II himself promised that London would rise again, greater than before. Out of tragedy came visionaries, Christopher Wren, with dreams of domes and spires that would pierce the heavens. Planners who sketched new streets broader and straighter, designed not for fire traps, but for future grandeur. The new city would be one of brick and stone, disciplined and ordered, a phoenix reborn from flame. But this rebirth was not only architectural, it was spiritual, psychological, a transformation of how London saw itself. The fire had stripped away illusions of invincibility. No longer could Londoners pretend that their city was eternal, immune to fate. They had looked into the furnace and seen how fragile their world truly was, and in that humility, in that recognition of mortality, there grew a determination fiercer than pride, the determination to build something that could endure. Legends flourished in the aftermath as they always do. Some swore they had seen angels in the smoke, guiding them to safety. Others whispered of devils dancing in the flames, mocking human weakness. The baker of Pudding Lane became an unwilling symbol, blamed by many for the spark that began it all, though the truth was far less certain. But symbols matter more than facts, and the fire became itself a symbol, a warning and a promise, a scar and a foundation. Even centuries later, the fire lives on in memory. It is etched into the soul of the city, as deeply as the plague, as indelibly as the Blitz. Every stone of St. Paul's rebuilt, every street laid straighter, every law passed to ban timber and mandate brick, is a testament to what was lost and to what was remade. The fire destroyed medieval London, but in its place gave birth to modern London. It was catastrophe, yes, but also crucible. For that child on Pudding Lane, grown old, the memory never faded. The night the sky turned to fire, the roar that shook the heavens, the sight of neighbors lost in smoke. Yet when he walked the rebuilt streets decades later, beneath the towering dome of Wren's St. Paul's, he knew that survival itself was a kind of victory. Tragedy had marked his generation, but rebirth had defined it. So it is with London. Burned, broken, scarred, but unbowed. The Great Fire did not end the city. It remade it. Out of destruction it forged resilience. Out of ash it summoned stone. Out of despair it shaped defiance. And this, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of 1666, that even in ruin, London refused to die.